What makes an excellent leader? And are they really that scarce? And what do they do to merit such exceptional compensation? Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. Your host is one of the world's leading experts on international leadership. She's a master certified coach and facilitates a mastermind for CEOs of international companies. She's the author of 3 books, Abrasive Leaders, Global Nomadic Leaders, and Managing Brilliant Jerks. She has worked with Nestle, Novartis, and even the United Nations. She's especially good at helping executives fast track to the C-suite. Welcome, Dr. Katrina Burrus.
Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Burrus, and today we have Peter Docker. Peter, most welcome.
Thanks, Katrina. It's wonderful to be on your show.
Yes, so I'm going to just tell our listeners that I'm traveling and I don't have my super gear. So if the sound is not optimal, I apologize ahead of time. But I thought it was just super important to interview Peter on his new book, Leading from the Jumpseat. So tell us a little bit about how you came about to writing that book, Peter.
Well, thanks, Katrina. I mean, the title, Leading from the Jumpseat, links to my past, actually. I spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force as a pilot, and I flew large passenger jets. And the title of the book, Leading from the Jumpseat, goes on to the subtitle, which is how to create extraordinary opportunities by handing over control. So I do use the metaphor of flying an aircraft actually throughout the book, because I think the flight deck of a large passenger jet is like a microcosm of leadership for me. And I've seen some of the best leadership and indeed some of the worst leadership. But perhaps it might be helpful, first of all, to explain what we mean by the jump seat, because not everybody is perhaps familiar of that. So would that help?
Yes, please do.
So, I mean, the book opens with a story that goes back some years when I was a senior officer in the Royal Air Force, senior pilot. And one of my roles was to check other pilots. And there was this one young chap by the name of Callum, who'd been a co-pilot for many years. And he'd just completed conversion to be a captain of the aircraft, to be in overall charge. And after 6 months of training, his last check, if you like, was to fly with someone like myself as the co-pilot, as the first officer. And I checked him and his performance as he flew from London over to Washington, Dulles, and then on to San Francisco. And as I'm sure you're well aware, San Fran is a busy old airport. And as we flew in, Callum did a great job. We touched down, taxied in, the passengers got off, and I was able to turn to him and say, Callum, fantastic job. You're fully signed up now as a fully qualified captain. We're going to stop here the night. And then tomorrow morning, you'll have a regular co-pilot flying us back to Washington. I'll be down the back with the other passengers, but you're good to go. And that, as you might imagine, is a fantastic moment, because he'd worked hard for this, and to be certified to fly a passenger jet with 140 passengers anywhere in the world is quite an accomplishment. So we stopped there the night, and on the following morning, Callum was doing his pre-flight preparation. He came to me and he said, "Excuse me, sir," and he called me sir because we're in the military, and I was several ranks above him, and that's how he referred to me. And he said, "Look, it's really busy here during rush hour at San Francisco. Can you come and sit on the jump seat to act as an extra pair of eyes as we taxi out and make sure that we go the right way and we spot other planes maneuvering?" And I said to him, "Yes, of course, Captain, I'd be delighted to do that." And I thought at the time how courageous that was, because he'd just got me off his back after about 6 months of being trained and checked. This is the first time that he wasn't going to have anybody watching over him. But no, he was more connected to the safety of the aircraft. And it was a good idea to have another pair of eyes, as in mine, to come and help watch out for other traffic as we taxied out. And where he wanted me to sit was on the jump seat. And the jump seat is a third seat on the flight deck of many aircraft, passenger jets, and it's immediately behind the seats for the captain and the co-pilot. So if you sit on the jump seat, you can reach and touch them on the shoulder. You're that close. And you get a great view through the flight deck windows. So that's where he wanted me to sit. So I strapped in, we taxied out. It was finally our turn to get airborne, and Callum had done a great job. And we thundered down the runway, and it was all going really well indeed, until we just lifted off. We're about 200 feet off the ground when we had an emergency. And that emergency was we hit severe turbulence. Now, turbulence up at 35,000 feet is uncomfortable, but it's rarely that dangerous. But down at 200 feet, it's really dangerous because you're so close to the ground. And what I decided to do in the next 2 seconds would dictate whether we all survived or not. And here's the thing, Katrina. I sat there perfectly calm with my hands in my lap and did absolutely nothing. And that's because I knew that Callum could sort out this emergency. As he wrestled with the controls, I knew he had the skills to sort it out. And in that moment, I didn't need to lead. I needed to take a step back and to become a great follower, for Callum to feel that I had his back. And this is where the term Jumpseat Leadership, where I coined that story is the inspiration of it. Because, you know, whether we're the CEO of a company or a team leader, or even as a parent, you know, when our kids grow up and leave home and start to lead their own lives, at some stage, we're going to take a step back. We're going to retire. We're going to shift teams, whatever. We are going to take that step back. And Jumpseat Leadership is all about lifting others up and empowering them. So when the time is right, they can take the lead and carry forward those things that we feel are really important to us. That's what Jumpseat Leadership is all about.
What you did there, first of all, he was highly qualified and he was well trained. It took courage to step back on your part, to not intervene, to transmit the confidence that you had in his ability.
Yeah.
So, and yet he felt probably the confidence that you were there if he needed you. So it's a great story.
Well, and my other reflection on that, and just building on what you've said there, Katrina, you know, first of all, if I wasn't confident that he could sort out the situation, why on earth did I sign him off the day before, qualified to fly 140 people around the world? You know, so when we delegate, it's not about abdicating, but it's certainly also not about micromanaging. And the thing that Callum needed was to feel I had his back. We can all sense that when others have our backs, when they have the confidence in us. And he was fully qualified, fully trained. He had the skills. I just needed to stay out of his way so as he could do what he needed to do. And clearly I'm speaking to you now, so it all worked out just fine.
So what happens when there's a leader in a company and he has to delegate? He doesn't have the time to do the job. He has other issues that are strategic for the company. But the person that he delegates to is probably not really ready.
Yeah. Well, going back to the example with Callum, you know, as you can tell from the story, he'd spent many years, if you like, as an apprentice, as the first officer, as the co-pilot. But then we'd equipped him with intensive training to make sure that he had all of the skills. So yes, he was ready for that. And I think this is a key thing. Quite often I see in companies around the world, people are elevated where they do not have the support. A classic happens in many companies. You know, when we go to school, when we go to university or college, we get rewarded for what we're good at. We tend to specialize in what we're good at. And then we go into a company, we're hired, say, as a computer programmer, because that's where we're specialized, and we're good at computer programming. And if we're very good at computer programming, eventually we'll get promoted. And then we reach the stage where we're no longer doing the programming, we're taking care of the people who are doing the programming as their manager, as their leader. And yet we very rarely get any training for that transition. And this, I find, is one of the biggest challenges, and I faced it too. But in the Air Force, in the Royal Air Force, where I spent 25 years, I was fortunate I did get that training where it meant that when I came to that point of transition, where I was no longer, in my case, the pilot of aircraft, I was looking after pilots, I had been equipped to lead those people and to take that step back. So yes, the example of Callum and that story out of San Francisco, that was the data point. But really, to understand properly how that was able to work so well, we need to dig deeper into the relationship that I had with Callum, the training that was put in place to support him, and the system which allowed us to lift other people up So when they were called upon to lead, they were fully equipped to do so.
And the other thing is, since you were hierarchically quite a bit higher than him in grade in the military, had you said anything, he would have probably just followed your orders instead of taking his own initiative or whatever. So it's also very, I'm glad you were, trained to delegate and be very careful of how you're delegating, because hierarchy, the underlying assumption is that the higher you are, the more you know, instead of letting the person figure it out.
And I go back to what I said earlier about the flight deck of a large aircraft, microcosm of leadership, great leadership, but also very poor leadership. And one of the stories I recount in my book goes back to 1977, when the world witnessed one of the worst air disasters of all time. And that is when a Dutch airline, KLM 747, started to roll down the runway at Tenerif North, and it was in fog. And what they didn't realize was that a Pan Am jumbo jet full of passengers had not cleared the runway. And very sadly, they collided, and over 500 people lost their lives that day.
That was terrible.
And the subsequent inquiry found that one of the major causes behind the accident was down to the captain of the KLM flight, Captain Van Zanten, who was a very, very experienced captain. He was in charge of training 747 pilots for KLM. He was literally the poster captain, the poster pilot. He appeared on all the adverts for KLM. And so from a hierarchical point of view, he was right up there. He was at the top of the tree. And his first officer, and indeed the flight engineer on the day, on that flight deck, they had a reasonable amount of seniority, but such was the context, such was the culture, they didn't feel able to question the captain. And there was a misunderstanding just before they started their takeoff roll. There was misunderstanding whether air traffic control had cleared them to take off or not. But because of, we call it a cockpit gradient, when you have a very junior person answering to a very senior captain, feeling not able to speak up. And that was the case on this day in March 1977. And the result was a lot of people lost their lives. Now, a very good outcome of that was that it created a great inquiry around just this situation on a flight deck of an aeroplane with a very senior person, a very junior person not being able to speak up. And since the 80s, all airline crews undergo what's called CRM, or crew resource management, which creates a culture whereby the most junior pilot or crew member can feel able to speak up when they sense that the senior person on the flight deck has missed something or has made a mistake. And
so how do they enable a junior person to speak up? Because that's pretty scary to speak up against someone so much senior.
It is. My last part of my flying career, I was a squadron commander, which in the military, in the Royal Air Force, the squadron is, if you like, the fighting unit of the organization. And so I led between 200 and 300 people, pilots and engineers, maintainers. And so I was very senior as far as everybody else was concerned. And yet I would fly the aircraft with some of the most junior people because of my experience, some of the most junior people because I needed to pass on that experience. And before we started engines, on every flight, I would turn to that junior pilot and I'd say, look, your job is to monitor what I'm doing and make sure that I don't make a mistake or miss something. And if you feel that you have any doubt, then you tell me. And it's okay. In fact, I'm expecting you to tell me. So in terms of answering the question, how do you create that environment? It starts with the most senior person being aware and being able to give the permission to people to speak up. And that involves embracing leading with what I call humble confidence rather than ego. And ego can creep in on a flight deck, as it did that day in 1977 with Captain Van Zanten. Ego can creep in when we're very senior, or we sense that our livelihood, our reputation, or our status is on the line. And the trouble is, when we start leading with the ego, it closes our view down. We just think about ourselves and moving forward and elevating ourselves. But we have a choice. And that choice is instead to inoculate against ego and lead instead with humble confidence. And what humble confidence is, it's about being absolutely resolute about where we're going, what we're doing with our business, what we're doing on our mission or our project, being ready to make the decisions when it's our time to make them. But importantly, having the humility to listen to others. And that is so vitally important, not only to avoid situations where we miss something vital, but also in terms of accelerating the performance of our team. If we lead with humble confidence, we're much more likely to do that rather than allowing ego to take control.
So you mentioned that you were trained in the military to transition from doing the work to helping other pilots, like you mentioned your story of how you did that.
Yes.
What can you talk about that training that you received to make this transition?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because it wasn't like we went off on a course for 6 months to train for this. It is much more part of the culture. You know, in military service, when I graduated from the Royal Air Force College in Cranwell in England as an officer at the age of 20, 21, similar to colleges of the same ilk in the US, all services, young officers, they are expected to lead people immediately after they've done their training. They are expected to lead people who are way senior in years and experience than they are, but they are enlisted people. So, you know, for example, I would have on my crew on an aircraft, other members of that crew who had decades more experience in the Royal Air Force and experience flying than I had. I had aircraft maintainers, engineers who knew everything, all the nuts and bolts of the aircraft. I didn't know about it. They had lots of experience, but I was senior in rank to them. And so I made the decision. But here's the thing. When you're in that situation, the only way you can not only survive, but thrive as a young officer is by practicing humility on a daily basis and asking for the input of the experts around you and the people with much more experience. Now, this doesn't mean to say that you're meek. That's the wrong end of the spectrum. It means to say that we have the humility to listen and to ask the important questions and then take the judgment and the decisions that are necessary to move us forward and take responsibility for those decisions. But it's a very, very different culture to what we find often in business. But it's a culture that is available to everyone should they choose to include it as part of their organization.
So speak a little bit to the difference in the military and the culture of the military and the culture of business.
Well, of course, it's very easy to generalize, and every business is different. But I'll recount the story. I won't mention the business for what will become obvious reasons, but it is written down in my book. I was running a workshop a few years ago for the C-suite of one of the biggest organizations around, and they had several divisions, and each division was larger than most companies by some margin. And as I gathered everybody together, the company was in difficulty, and they obviously needed to do something differently in order to get out the spot where they were at. But as I looked around the room, all I could see was ego stepping forward, with the divisional heads sort of sizing each other up and giving banter towards it and denigrating each other, you know. And when that happens, it tends to be infectious, and everybody else kind of joins in. And that was not a good starting point. But what didn't help was that the CEO at the time, he didn't intervene. He didn't show any ego. He didn't show any humble confidence. He almost withdrew. And so that immediate culture, that behavior was allowed to continue. And sadly, because no one chose to step up, and sometimes, well, you know, it's very easy for people perhaps listening saying, well, yeah, I've been in that situation, but hey, I'm not the CEO or I'm not the divisional head. Yeah, you don't need to be. You do, though, have a choice to be the voice in the room who questions what's going on, regardless of your rank or position. Yes, it will take courage, but quite often when, in my experience, when that is done, when somebody does step up, it punctuates the moment, it slows things down and has people start to reflect on the way they're behaving, and it helps to put ego back in its box. So the difference between the commercial environment and the military environment is most of the time your life is not on the line. But nonetheless, ego does rise up when your livelihood, status, or reputation is under threat. And that is exactly the same driver that causes ego to come to the fore. And we have exactly the same choice with courage to choose instead humble confidence and put ego to one side.
Very, very interesting. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our podcast, and I want to know, where can people get a hold of you?
Well, they can Google me, Peter Docker, and also find me on my website, leadingfromthejumpseat.com, and in the usual places on social media. And the book is available through all the usual outlets, Amazon being the main one, of course. And in that book, I share all of these ideas and many more, but it's a how-to guide. This isn't just reflections, it's a how-to guide. Bring Jumpseat leadership to any organization, no matter what size or sector.
Great. All these show notes will be on my website and on all the social media platforms. Leading from the Jumpseat is the book. I can't wait to read it. Unfortunately, I didn't get it before our interview, but I look very much into reading it. You're a great storyteller as well. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Katrina. Thank you.
We would love to know what you thought of this podcast. Write us an email at drkatrina with a K at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. We would love to hear what you liked and what we could improve. This podcast has been sponsored by excellentexecutivecoaching.com.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burrus' CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.